Good evening, and thank you for being here. Tonight's lecture examines one of the most urgent issues of our time, the ideological and spiritual struggle between radical Islam and the modern world. In Countering Islamic Jihad, I argue that to truly defeat terrorism, we must first understand its roots, worldview, and spiritual foundation. This is not merely a geopolitical battle, but a moral and theological one, a clash between two visions of humanity, one that exalts coercion and conquest, and one that defends freedom and conscience. The book's central thesis is clear. You cannot defeat an ideology you refuse to define. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll explore the key sections of this book. 1. The meaning of jihad, misconception, and reality. 2. The ideological foundations of radical Islam. 3. The Western response, political, military, and cultural weakness. 4. The role of faith and moral clarity in countering extremism. And 5. The path forward, restoring courage and conviction. The book begins by confronting one of the most misunderstood words in global discourse, jihad. In its classical Arabic sense, jihad means struggle. There are indeed forms of inner jihad, spiritual discipline, moral striving, but the book notes that radical movements have historically emphasized the external or armed jihad as a divine command to expand Islam by force. The book carefully distinguishes between ordinary Muslims and Islamic jihadists, arguing that while most Muslims reject violence, the jihadist ideology draws from long-standing interpretations of Islamic texts. The book cites the writings of Sa'id Khatib and Abul Ala Maududi, ideologues who taught that jihad was a permanent struggle until Islamic law ruled the world. He then points to Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as inheritors of this intellectual lineage, men who turned theology into terror. The book writes, Jihadism is not born of poverty or ignorance, but of conviction, the conviction that God commands the subjugation of all unbelievers. The book cautions that misunderstanding jihad as mere personal struggle leaves policymakers blind to the religious and historical forces that drive global extremism. The book devotes significant attention to what it calls the theology of domination. It traces the jihadist worldview to early Islamic history, particularly the Medinan period of Muhammad's life, when Islam transitioned from a persecuted faith to a ruling power. It was during this period that jihad, as warfare against non-believers, became institutionalized. This ideology, the book explains, is not an aberration but a radical return to early precedents. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda seek not modern reform but restoration, a recreation of the 7th century caliphate under divine law. Key ideological elements include Tawhid, oneness of God used to justify political absolutism, Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb, the world divided between Islamic territory and the House of War, Sharia supremacy, divine law above human law. The book emphasizes that this theological absolutism leaves no room for pluralism, democracy, or freedom of conscience. The book states, jihadism is not just a reaction to Western policy, it's the consistent application of its own sacred texts, interpreted literally and politically. This section challenges the modern West relativism mindset, which assumes that all religions are morally equivalent and all interpretations equally valid. The book argues that moral clarity begins with honest theological diagnosis, naming evil where it originates. The next major theme in countering Islamic Jihad is the failure of the West to recognize the nature of the enemy. The book critiques both left and right for responding to jihadism as if it were merely a security issue, a problem of extremists, not ideology. The book observes that Western governments often avoid religious terminology altogether, preferring words like violent extremism or terrorist networks. But by stripping the problem of its theological dimension, they disarm themselves intellectually. The West fights with weapons, the book writes, while jihadists fight with worldview. It traces the evolution of U.S. and European policy from 9/11 to the rise of ISIS, showing how inconsistent leadership, withdrawal from cultural self-confidence, and fear of offending religious sensitivities created a vacuum that extremists exploited. This section also examines media and academic complicity, institutions that prefer to sanitize the motives of terrorists, describing them as disaffected youth or victims of imperialism. The book challenges that narrative. We cannot explain away beheadings and bombings as unemployment protests. Ideas have consequences, and theology has armies. It argues that multiculturalism, while noble in intent, has too often become moral paralysis, the inability to distinguish civilization from barbarism. Without moral conviction, the West cannot defend its own values of liberty, equality, and justice. At this point, the book shifts from critique to prescription. If the problem is fundamentally moral and ideological, the solution must be too. It insists that secularism cannot defeat religious fanaticism. Only a stronger moral and spiritual vision can. The book calls for a renewal of the Judeo-Christian foundations that built Western civilization, the belief that every person bears the image of God and that freedom of conscience is sacred. In the book's view, the decline of faith in the West has created a vacuum that radical ideologies eagerly fill. Where meaning is absent, absolutism thrives. The book quotes G.K. Chesterton. When men cease to believe in God, they do not believe in nothing. They believe in anything. The book's argument is not for religious coercion, but for spiritual coherence, a reaffirmation of truth, moral order, and courage in public life. It proposes a multi-front strategy. Intellectual clarity, calling jihadism what it is, a totalitarian religious ideology. Cultural confidence, teaching the moral superiority of freedom over tyranny. Strategic engagement, confronting both the theological and material sources of radicalism. Faith renewal, restoring the spiritual vitality that gives Western civilization meaning. The book concludes this section with a challenge to believers and citizens alike. A civilization unwilling to defend its faith will be conquered by one that will. The final section of Countering Islamic Jihad moves from theory to exhortation. The book insists that this struggle will not be won by armies alone, but by truth, courage, and conviction. It compares the present age to the early centuries of Christendom, when small bands of believers resisted the pagan empires not by sword, but by steadfastness and truth. Similarly, it calls for moral realism, recognizing that evil exists and must be opposed. Peace, it argues, cannot be purchased through denial or appeasement. The book writes, "The lesson of history is that appeasement invites aggression. When a society refuses to name its enemies, it eventually forgets its friends." It envisions victory not as domination but as renewal, the moral reawakening of free societies willing to live by the truth they profess. As we conclude, the book's Countering Islamic Jihad is not simply a study of terrorism, it's a call to conscience. It asks, can a civilization survive without faith? Can tolerance endure when faced with intolerance? And will freedom defend itself when threatened by those who despise it? The book's answer is both sobering and hopeful. The battle for civilization is not fought only on foreign soil. It is fought in the soul of every free person who still believes that truth is worth defending. Ultimately, Countering Islamic Jihad reminds us that the real war is not between nations or religions, but between truth and deception, courage and fear, light and darkness.